So, thanks so much for coming out. My name is Dr. Michael Fiddler. I'm an Associate Professor of Criminology over at the University of Greenwich, and I will be talking about ghost criminology. And I do agree, Dr. Fiddler is an unfortunate name for a criminologist. We were all thinking it. I heard one person say it. But just to let you know, essentially, that's the only joke I've got in for the next 15 minutes. It starts bleak, and in about 17 minutes, we're going to hit a peak of, let's call it, existential despair. So just as long as we're all on the same page, that this is what you've chosen to spend this evening doing. So, ghost criminology. This is something I've been working on for a few years with colleagues in the UK, US, Australia, and Sweden. And it's kind of a way, drawing upon like some of the ideas we heard about in the earlier session, in thinking kind of differently about time and thinking about the ways in which past events, future events can make us think differently about the present. But we'll kind of get into that. Today's session is going to be interactive. I told you it was going to be bleak. So if you'd like to join in, I'm going to be using something called Mentimeter. You can, if you've got a smartphone, go for that QR code, or you can go directly to menti.com and enter the code 69, 75, 15, and 90. Once you've done that, I can see a few people kind of hitting the thumbs up sign. If you could do that, just gives me a sense that you've been able to log in okay. Just whilst people are doing that, quick content warning. I'm talking about ghost criminology. There's going to be some references to death, some references to violent crimes, violent acts, but no particular kind of like detail to those. I'm not going to be showing any imagery, in my opinion, that would cause concern. Just to run through some of the structure for today's session, I'm going to start off unpacking what I mean by ghost criminology, a little bit more detail. Then I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey from the kind of the beginnings of criminologists using ideas of spectrality, hauntology, leading into, in what can only be described as a shameless plug, a book that I worked on for a little bit. It's available on Amazon, apparently. Just saying. And then looking at the ways in which students have been able to kind of pick up those ideas in the book and run with them in ways that we couldn't anticipate, but good ways. So, that's the structure. It's helpful, I think, to start off briefly by running through what criminology is. I'm sure lots of you have kind of got a familiarity with it, but just in case, we often get mixed up with criminalistics, forensic science, and whilst, and again, another plug, we do offer some of that within the criminology program at the University of Greenwich, and there's an amazing forensics team based at Medway. That's not really our bag. Neither really things like criminal psychology or kind of criminal profiling. For those, and this will be kind of like judging people's kind of age ranges, that's either going to be Mindhunter, Criminal Minds, or Cracker. I'm a Cracker guy. It's not really that. There is some colleagues do look at criminal profiling. The tradition that I came from was much more kind of sociology of deviance, but I'll unpack that in a little bit more in a second. But essentially, the project of criminology can be boiled down to addressing these three questions. So Stanley Cohen, back in the late 80s, in a slightly unhelpful book titled Against Criminology, said that criminologists are interested in why are laws made, why they're broken, and what do we or should we do about that? So three quite simple questions, but the answers that they elicit are far from simple and, touch wood, enough to fill out a 3-year undergraduate degree program. One of the other things that I really love about the discipline is that it's a rendezvous subject. So it's a comparatively new discipline, criminology, certainly in comparison to, as a nod to a colleague, psychology, things like this. And it means that kind of criminologists are kind of open to what's going on in other disciplines. So in order to address those three questions that co-imposed, we're drawing upon ideas from psychology, but also biology, history, philosophy, psychoanalysis. That was easy for me to say. Other disciplines, all in the kind of project of trying to address those three questions and try to kind of expand our understanding of crime, criminality, and punishment. So, that's the criminology bit. Where does the ghostly stuff come in? Well, this is where I'm going to hand over to you for a second, because our understandings of the ghost's spectrality, possibly based in kind of like understandings from culture, is really important to the next kind of couple of slides. So, first off, have you ever seen a ghost? I should imagine the person that asked the question about qualitative versus quantitative earlier on is now tearing their hair out. It's Pint of Science. Why am I answering this? So, I'm enjoying the brave two people over here, feeling emboldened by the anonymity of the format. But just as whilst people are kind of answering that, I am going to say somewhat confusingly, I am simultaneously, yes, maybe, but also, no, there are no such things. If no one asks any questions during the Q&A, then I can bore you rigid with that essentially non-story. But, okay, we're kind of we're skewing to kind of like no's and definitely no's. But, and this is helpful because you've already done it, were you to see a ghost, what would be your reaction? So just in case you can't quite make out the wordle, we've got the main term is fear, shock, perhaps some curiosity. A couple of people gone, ah. Let's go with that. I should just quickly say, I've asked students this in a lecture, and one person typed, I'd kick it. Famously incorporeal forms, but super excited, trauma. I think that's just aimed at me. So, yeah, mixture of kind of like fear, shock, surprise. Well, if we think about the function of the ghost's spectrality in popular culture, they elicit these kinds of responses because they're forces that emerge from the past into the present. They break boundaries, they break temporal boundaries, they break boundaries of life and death, and we find that, well, it induces kind of anxiety, curiosity, fear. The role that they also play in supernatural fiction is that they emerge often from the past with a message to say that something is unresolved, that an injustice perhaps has been done, a debt needs to be owed. And there's a fantastic example from popular fiction, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but that's from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. You've got Ebenezer Scrooge being visited by three ghosts, ghost of Christmas past, ghost of Christmas present, and ghost of Christmas yet to come. So if we go to the first one, ghost of Christmas past, that's Jacob Marley, isn't it? Figure emerging from the past to tell Ebenezer Scrooge, I keep telling myself, don't say Ebenezer Good, don't say Ebenezer Good. Again, it dates you. Ebenezer Scrooge emerges from the past into the present with a message, revealing that there are past harms, past traumas in Scrooge's life that have gone unresolved and inform our understanding of his character in the present. There's also the ghost of Christmas yet to come, a figure, a force from the future emerging into Scrooge's present to talk about the ways in which the harms he's enacting in the present are going to lead to lost futures, not just for him, but for poor old Tiny Tim as well. And it's that element of spectrality that I want to tease out for us in relation to this idea of ghost criminology, because we can use it in some kind of interesting ways. So let's kind of go back. I was going to tell you like a bit about the journey of developing this idea of ghost criminology. If we can kind of get to it in the Q&A, I can tell you about the ways in which criminology has always and already been haunted by this kind of language, but particularly over the last 10 years or so, an increasing number of criminological researchers have been using the language of spectrality and haunting to explore those three questions that Cohen posed and to elucidate our understanding of crime, criminality, and punishment. First of which was my colleague, sorry if I'm in your way there,
no, you're fine.
Travis Linneman, based at Kansas State University. He wrote a piece called Capote's Ghosts. So this is Truman Capote that you can see on the screen in front of you. He wrote the true crime classic, In Cold Blood. It got published in 1966, and it was about the murder of the Clutter family in Kansas in 1959. And Travis writes in this particular piece about the ways in which that case, that act of violence, haunts Kansas, haunts that particular kind of area of the state. And he talks about the ways in which it's haunting the social imaginary of that population. It affects the emotional responses that people have to that space, their cognitive maps of the space, the discourse around it. He talks about the ways in which violence lingers or sits in place. It's a really kind of interesting, powerful term that people have kind of picked up and run with. Get to that more in due course. Another example comes from someone called Catherine Biber. She talks about the afterlives of evidence. In other words, what is done with the kind of the physical evidence on the completion of a trial. She has a couple of case studies that she explores, one of which involves an artist working at the International Criminal Court who, upon completion of cases, would gather together documentary evidence and use it as part of their artistic practice, raising some potentially kind of interesting ethical questions. Another case she talks about relates to the disappearance and death of Azaria Chamberlain. So some of you might be kind of familiar with this case already. Back in the early 1980s, someone called Lindy Chamberlain, Azaria's mother, was on a road trip in Australia with her husband. And Azaria, who was 9 weeks old at the time, disappeared. All that was found were the bloodied clothes that she'd been dressed in. And Lindy Chamberlain, the mother, thought that potentially a wild dog had taken this young baby. Lindy Chamberlain, the mother, was initially imprisoned for murder, but on subsequent appeals, subsequent kind of retrials, was found innocent. What Catherine Biber does is explores the uses to which the physical evidence that was collected and collated surrounding that case, what it was put to. So all of the physical evidence, up to and including the car that they were driving, now belongs as part of the collection for the National Museum of Australia. And what we can say is that, and what kind of Catherine kind of suggests, is that these items, these physical objects, are kind of imbued not only with kind of like personal unresolved trauma, but also a national unresolved trauma, given that this has been seen as a notorious miscarriage of justice. So we've kind of got, with Travis's work, landscapes haunted by violence, with this, physical objects tainted by, in this instance, kind of miscarriages of justice, and something that I kind of explored as well, building kind of, or running adjacent to Travis's work about Kansas. My work focused on a couple of streets in London's East End and looking at the various violences, traumas enacted on the populations that inhabited those streets over the last century or so. Going back to the rookeries and the slum areas in and around the Whitechapel area, through to the murders of Jack the Ripper. And if you're kind of unfamiliar with this area, you might have seen them around. You might have noticed there's a chip shop called Jack the Chipper, which on first glance is kind of like, oh yeah, it's kind of funny. But then, is it now? I'll just leave that one hanging in the air. Then other kind of tragedies that have kind of occurred in the area include, the Battle of Cable Street, the political violence there, the racist murder of Alti Ali in the late 70s, was kind of able to kind of like unpack the ways in which this area is a space in distress. I was able to use kind of like psychoanalytic terms to kind of try and read this particular space. So, those are a couple of examples of the spectral turn that's occurred within the discipline over the last 10 years or so. Let me throw it out to you. I've mentioned Travis's work in relation to Kansas and violence sitting or lingering in place there. I mentioned my work in relation to the East End. Can you think of other examples of other sites where violence lingers? So, just in case you can't see them, I'll read out a few ones that I can kind of remember anyway. So, you've got Ground Zero in Manhattan, various sites associated with genocide. I think it might have kind of like zipped past. One person said the traumatized brain, which is a super interesting response. And I will mention them. Someone said my toilet. And there was another gross one as well. You all know who you were. But these are all kind of like really kind of interesting examples. Grenfell, I'll come back to in a slide or two's time. So, myself and Travis, who I kind of mentioned earlier, we've been kind of working together over the last kind of like few years, and we wanted to try and pull together the strands of this particular project. And this was kind of like the early doors of coming up with a ghost criminology. And we were drawn towards the work of Jacques Derrida, his work on hauntology that we kind of heard about kind of earlier, and Mark Fisher. Now, if you want to follow this up, there's the book. It's completely gone out of my head. Give me 2 seconds afterwards. I'll let you know there. It's brilliant. It's a collection of his essays, and he kind of unpacks his understanding, his uses of hauntology, and he boils it down to this. He suggests that it's kind of essentially things which are no longer, but which remain effective, and well as kind of things that have not yet happened, but which are already effective.
Ghosts of my life.
Ghosts of my life, perfect, thank you. Can you get a prize?
Yeah,
okay. And that set of ideas, the kind of hauntological ideas from Derrida, how it spanned through kind of Mark Fisher's work, really kind of began to underpin our project of a ghost criminology. And we kind of boiled things down for ourselves to suggest this, and this again, shameless plug, apologies. We wanted to focus on the ghost and ghost ed as our focus, our conceptual target. We wanted to look at those objects, those phenomena, be it people, places, concepts, that make our present waver, that are perhaps emerging from the past into the present or from the future into the present, and reveal to us unresolved social harms. We also wanted to look at, and this is more towards the kind of Derridean thing to do with kind of visuality, phenomena that hover between visibility and invisibility. In particular, we wanted to look at the ways in which particular groups, particular individuals, maybe even kind of concepts, are rendered invisible, pushed out of sight, and maybe even pushed out of place as well. To give an example of that latter one, Jeff Ferrell, one of the contributors to our book, explored the invisible by focusing upon those without home, and in his expression, gutter punks, hobos, dumpster divers and trash pickers. groups who have been pushed out of sight, out of visibility, out of place. And his task, what he generated, was what he referred to as a ghost method, a way of reading the social when life had been pushed out of a particular location. So he was finding traces of past practice. Another colleague, Daniel Robbins, came up with an idea of toxic necro-waste. Fantastic term. And that's to describe the unease felt around the bodies of perhaps formerly kind of notorious offenders. And he has a particular case study of Ian Brady. And he highlights how mortuaries, upon hearing of Brady's death, didn't want to receive this body. It was still somehow contaminated, symbolically contaminated, toxic, based on the notoriety of what he'd done in life. Which again throws up this really interesting question about punishment. When do we want punishment to end? For Ian Brady, his just desserts extended right to the end of his life and then pushed on into his death. And then finally, and as someone kind of mentioned it on one of the kind of earlier slides, Alison Young explored the area around Grenfell Tower. She spoke about the ways in which, in the days and weeks following the fire, the population who lived around Grenfell felt as though they were living in the shadow of an open mass grave. And this was a wound that remained open, because as days and weeks turned into months and then years, at ground level, the signs, the hundreds of memorials around the Grenfell site to the people that were lost, as well as the looming tower itself, meant that the tragedy was an ever-present part of people's life. It was present. It hadn't been allowed to kind of slip into the past. It hadn't been able to be formally, properly memorialised. And there's an important reason for that, because, as we know, that tragedy was avoidable. And so perhaps it's understandable that it remained this open wound. So, the book came out, included those kinds of chapters about those kinds of topics, and our students just picked up this idea and ran with it, really kind of interesting, unanticipated ways. One of them, I've just finished marking her undergraduate dissertation, looked at using Jeff Ferrell's idea of a ghost method to explore the kind of populations rendered invisible. And she applied it to the disappeared, the victims of political violence in Colombia. Another student, this one a master's student, looked at the not yet. Many of these examples have been to do with the no longer, but which are already effective, things of the past emerging into the present. This other student looked at the not yet, anticipating future harm, anticipating future violence, with a particular focus on the architecture of high schools. And she was able to see that with contemporary kind of US high school design, there's a lack of long corridors, precisely to stop an active shooter being able to see down them. Similarly, the fabric of the building itself is reinforced with metal to stop bullets passing through it. Again, the fabric of the building itself is anticipating future violence, future losses. And that's the direction I'm interested in taking this as well, the not yet. And my argument is focused on kind of ecological harms and thinking about the ways in which, when wildfires coursed up and down the coasts of the US, turning the skies above San Francisco an otherworldly orange, we're not being visited by the ghost of Christmas yet to come, we're being visited by the ghost of climate catastrophe. And with this particular idea, we have a sense of harms of the present prefiguring disaster of the future. Someone called Rose suggested that this was a double death. Deaths of non-human animals in the present prefiguring extinction in the future. Told you about 17 minutes ago, it'll be existentially bleak. I'd like to say it picks up from here, it really doesn't. A final note on which to end. In the midst of COVID, when I was sat at my kitchen table trying to come up with some ideas for a conclusion for the book, I came across an old chat show appearance by James Baldwin. And he was asked to reflect on the afterlives of slavery in the context of the civil rights movement at that particular time. And he said, all your buried corpses are now beginning to speak. Well, criminology has got an awful lot of corpses to listen to, and we need to start listening. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.